and welcome to the new school. My name is Amanda Parmer, and as curator of the Verilis Center for Art and Politics, it is a pleasure to introduce the second of our Public Art Fund talks at the new school this spring. This series of talks, a joint initiative between the Public Art Fund and the Verilis Center for Art and Politics, conceives of New York City as an urban campus, as an artist studio, and importantly, as a commons. In this context, we're looking forward to hearing Amanda Ross-Ho's reflections on her public works in the cities of Basel, New York, and Chicago over the past 5 years, and the cultural critique these public artworks make accessible by resituating familiar everyday materials in Ross-Ho's notably wry personal lexicon. Before I begin, I would like to invite you all to join us for our 25th year anniversary event this coming April. Will be on the 21st, which is a Saturday. And the event, An Index to Art and Politics, 25 Years of Verilis Center Fellowships, is an afternoon series of conversations with and among our fellows, whose work and ideas have been informing and are informed by the Verilis Center over the past quarter of a century. These conversations have evolved from private exchanges between the fellows through the spring, where they considered the interrelatedness of their individual projects with their current practice. The Verilis Center Fellows who are participating in this afternoon of public conversations on Saturday, April 21st include Wendy Ewald, Casey Golan, Sharon Hayes, Ashley Hunt, Bushra Khalili, Lorraine O'Grady, Alexander Provan, Robert Sember, Victoria Sobel, and Jonathan Weinberg. The live event is complemented by a reader, which doubles as an index, recording and accounting for the generative engagements between our fellows that underpin the day's conversations. Collectively, they conjure the meaning, importance, and necessity of the interdisciplinary nature of our fellowship projects today. More information about this event and the publication is included in your program and on the Verilis Center website. I want to thank you all very much for coming this evening, and now I'm pleased to welcome to the stage Daniel S. Palmer.
Good evening. I'm Daniel S. Palmer, Associate Curator at Public Art Fund. Thank you all for being here this evening with us. And thank you especially to Amanda Ross-Ho for speaking tonight at Public Art Fund's spring season of talks at the new school, organized in collaboration with the Verilis Center for Art and Politics. We had a great talk with Yinka Shonabari at the beginning of this month, and we look forward to having Anselm Kiefer speak on April 30th. I think there's a few tickets left. Amanda is an extremely talented artist who works in many media. She has had solo exhibitions at the University of Georgia, Bonner Kunstverein in Bonn, and to sort of break with the traditional biography, I just sort of have to highlight that she's basically had solo exhibitions at almost all of the museums of contemporary art. The Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland in 2014, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 2013, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles in 2012, and also was in a group exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, as well as participating in group shows at the Walker, in MoMA's New Photography in 2010, in the 2008 Whitney Biennial, and in Public Art Fund's Image Objects at City Hall Park in 2015. And especially with her contributions to image objects, and in the other exhibition gallery shows that of her work that I've seen, I've been so impressed with the way that she compellingly analyzes the appropriation and dissemination of images in our digital era. What's more, her work has been particularly well-suited to the context of public art, especially her use of enlarged everyday items that are presented in such a way that is often theatrical, occasionally comical, and always insightful. Please join me in welcoming Amanda to the stage, and I hope you'll think of some good questions to ask her when we open up to the audience at the end of her talk. Thank you. Amanda.
I guess we're going to bring the house lights down and go a little romantic. Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Public Art Fund. Thank you, New School, for having me. It's a real pleasure and a treat to be here with you guys today. I'm I'm going to do something a little different, and I may fail, which is to try to focus on a couple of projects specifically rather than giving kind of a more exhaustive overview of my practice for the past bunch of years. And so we'll see how that goes. And what I want to talk about today is the idea of scale and image in particular, in terms of how it relates to the kind of nesting of direct and mediated experience. And yeah, so I'm going to set that conversation up with a couple of really specific projects that are not the main things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to kind of fly through those quickly. But I thought I would actually start with this image from the seminal film, Police Academy, which is an image of a individual floating in a giant camera down, basically floating away to sea. And I thought this was a perfect image to kind of set up some of the conversations I'm going to talk about in terms of scale shifting and pictorial implications in terms of objects. When I think about scale, and particularly in relation to the public projects that I'm going to primarily talk about, I think one of the things that, or I kind of broke it down into three kind of primary concerns. One being the idea of intimacy and the anatomical understanding of form, and that's something I'll go into a little bit more specifically with some of the objects I'm going to show you. Again, the pictorial implications of objects, and then also the idea of translation. And so those three things are something that are things that kind of come up regularly throughout the work. I'm going to start by showing a couple of really specific things. These are older works, but just to set that conversation up. Starting in around 2008, I made a bunch of works that approach scale in a very particular way. These are architectural surgeries that kind of performed exchanges between the studio and the exhibition space, or the studio and museum space, museum institution space, thinking about scale as a gesture in a really particular way. So this is an image of my studio in East LA in 2000, just before that, 2007. This is another view, just kind of a production image, and I'm jumping right in here. Just to give you a kind of sense of that, I'd been in this studio for about 3 years, and thinking about how to kind of negotiate the space of presentation and production. And those are things that I still think about and still come up regularly in all of the work, particularly the most recent work. What happened with this studio is that we had built temporary production spaces within a very large warehouse. There were about 11 artists in this space, and we were forced to actually leave this studio. And this fortuitous circumstance kind of dovetailed with an invitation to do a large-scale installation. So I'm just showing you sort of the pre-studio shots. So I took this as kind of a sign to kind of lean into that circumstance, and I cut the studio up into these panels. And again, I'm going to kind of fly through these quickly. But bringing this architecture, literally exporting the architecture out of the studio space and bringing it into a museum space is the Orange County Museum in the context of the California Biennial in 2008. And the resulting installation was sort of a totemic installation of the wall panels that were not seamed back together to kind of create this sense of spectacle, but instead to kind of think about these walls that had housed the production of my work for several years, kind of accumulating or absorbing or recording almost the sort of larger organism throughout the period of time. And so they sort of occupy a flattened pictorial space and compositional space. This is the other side of that installation. And then moving through other forms in terms of intimacy, just thinking about objects that had belonged to me that I would kind of, again, kind of mine for their form. This is a large-scale T-shirt work that I made in roughly around 2010 that had belonged to me, and I had myself had created the patina through labor on its surface, then translating that to a large-scale object. So this is about 9 feet tall. This is a studio apron, similar scale, 8 or 9 feet. Just thinking about how that peripheral space of production had kind of created this other aesthetic space. And so these are translations. The materials list as paint on canvas, although it's actually, a highly kind of articulated textile version of that apron. And so these become very autobiographical. This is a smock that had actually been part of my studio. You can see that the actual black paint had been accumulated through studio use. And then what happened with this smock is that I actually carried it with me in a bag and was going to a job site to work on a project, and a bucket of red paint exploded on it. So it became this kind of weird accidental kind of composition. So I translated this to large scale as well. And this is where that sense of the anatomical becomes really critical. The way that I end up kind of dissecting it's almost like an autopsy, like taking this object apart and really figuring out how to recreate it. So this is acrylic paint on linen. So this is hand dyed. And those knitted areas that you see are actually hand-knitted cuffs to meet the scale of the garment. And so some of these implications become kind of, are really where I'm kind of looking at how to translate that scale to something that, forms a type of intimacy. There's another detail of that piece of that knitted cuff there. There's another detail of that. And then moving through from that to some other pieces that translate other objects from the studio space. This is a large-scale glove piece I've made a series of for the past couple years. They're based on nitrile gloves from the studio that have accumulated the patina of work and progress of labor in the actual space. Of course, they're a textile, but they're also this opportunity to kind of figure out how to create sort of this backdoor into abstraction. And so this is a way for me to kind of like find ways to make paintings, which is another narrative that I won't talk about tonight, but is something that comes up as well. These are large scale as well. These are about 8 feet, and they vary. In some cases, they're made in pairs, and in some cases, they're really direct translations. In some cases, some of that activity is imagined. Okay, and now I want to talk a little bit about some fabricated sculptures that kind of lead us a little closer into the public works I'm going to primarily kind of focus on. And one of the things, as I was talking about the pictorial implications of objects, is that one of the ways that I research for most of my projects is through image. And I'm going to show you, this is a sculpture, which I'll talk about in a second, but I'm going to show you the source of that. So this is not the exact image. It's the best one I could find somewhere deep in my archive. So eBay is an engine that I've been using for quite a long time because it is a point of access to objects through image, right? And so when I first started looking at eBay, which everyone does, it's not an uncommon activity, but I started getting interested in the vernacular photography that was coming through these engines because specifically the images that were on here were working images. They're images of utility that really specifically are meant to give you access to the dimensions or the contours of the details or the sort of anatomy of that object. And so I started collecting images from eBay very early, and then eventually started purchasing objects and translating them into sculptures. So this object is a large-scale translation of one of those pins. The original is a comedy tragedy. This one is a tragedy in tragedy, which is an alteration. So in some cases, I will make kind of changes to the original. This was made in collaboration with a prop master that I've collaborated with in Los Angeles for many, many years, who specializes in props for film. And that becomes another kind of implication in the work as well, thinking about objects that are lens sensitive. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is a detail of that sculpture. And there are kind of a lot of different technical things that went into making this work. But primarily, what I was interested in was, what could be accessed through the image in terms of pulling it through space into being an object again. And that's something that has kind of continued to resonate. I'll show a couple more pieces from that body of work. This is another pin. In this version, actually this one chronologically is part of that one. You're looking into the negative cavity of a pin. So you see the clasp on the inside of that pin. Again, in that eBay engine, you're sort of given access to the front, the back, the side, all of the ways that you might imagine kind of accessing that three-dimensional object. This is the actual photograph from eBay originally. And so this becomes a project of kind of, again, mining this image and figuring out what we can access. Okay. This is another piece also found on eBay. Around that time, I was also mining for these other databases of kind of interesting materiality. So this was a period of time where I was finding single earrings that had lost their partners. And this had this kind of poetic implication that I thought was interesting. But there's also a currency to this objecthood that is essentially kind of being liquidated for its lack of functionality, right? So the pair had been split, and so that kind of split binary kind of offers this kind of useless remainder. And so that had sort of triggered some kind of rescuing impulses in me, but I also found some really interesting, specifically individual pieces. So this is one that was based on an earring. It's kind of the quintessential single earring, honestly. Obviously, the other pair suggesting that the other pair would say here today. This is a scale version of, or a scale reference to give you kind of a sense of that. And you know, one of the things I'm really kind of invested in, particularly with these pieces, is meeting the fabrication, meeting kind of, as best as I can, the terms of the original object. So this one actually is made up of a bunch of different materials. So there's, I think, a sterling silver, plated, I think it's a plated brass, and then a 24 karat gold. And so I was really trying to kind of recapitulate this object as almost like a scale shift that all of the materiality remains, has an integrity that remains. Okay, and I'll talk about this project a little bit. This is a show I did at MoCA in 2012, a survey exhibition. And I'm not going to talk about the whole show, but I want to talk about a little bit about the centerpiece of the show. And what I'm obviously kind of leading up to is my use of scale kind of leading to public space, this being kind of a prime example. The centerpiece of this exhibition, I should say this, the survey was something that I took very literally and produced a survey exhibition that was about the idea of survey rather than an actual recapitulation of earlier works. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of look back at my own creative origins and think about, you know, what objects I could pull through to kind of talk about the arc of my practice. And so this, the center sculpture that you're looking at is a fabricated sculpture of a mid-60s photo enlarger from, that had belonged to my parents that I grew up with. In order to produce this object, this is an incredibly, was an incredibly complex, again, anatomical project. I worked with a Hollywood fabricator, the same one that I mentioned earlier. And what we did was we took the object apart completely, piece by piece, and recreated each thing to scale. This stands 13 feet tall, and I'll show you some details of this. The reason I wanted to show this image is I really wanted to talk about, again, that idea of the pictorial implication. So obviously the fact of it being an enlarger, photo enlarger relating to image, but also the idea that everything in that space was subject to this new condition created, I felt like, by this object, that the actual fabrication of each kind of element of this thing had this fidelity or resolution that kind of felt like linked to picture making, right? So linked to kind of this pictorial resolution. And so the reason to work alongside a prop maker in specific is because I really wanted, with this piece in particular, I make many, many things with my own hands, but with this object, I wanted there to be an absolute fidelity down to the cell. In other words, as you walk up to it, the object does not break down and remains that kind of that object through and through, but completely scaled to an absurd degree. I was also poking fun at myself in terms of my own use of scale, so the enlarged and larger became a redundancy and kind of a linguistic thing I was also interested in. So the way that this is made is through a bunch of psychotic production means. All of that hardware is cast plastic, hand-painted. Bakelite knobs are created through resins and paints, and those are knurled knobs, if any of you are familiar with that nerdy thing. This is a lens that was created with all sorts of objects. It obviously has no functionality. All of that dirt and that kind of, the patina of its use is recreated in full makeup. It's carved foam, painted foam. More hardware. the on-off switch, which obviously does not have electrical components. Custom extruded rubber, all kinds of insane kind of processes that led to making this thing. This is a scale reference to give you kind of a sense of that. It's my sneaker. And then a full human reference as well. Alongside that piece, there was another set of works I want to just quickly touch on. This is a pair of paintings that I made for that same exhibition that were translations of 2 paintings I had made when I was 4 years old. It was a diptych that was in my mother's house for years and years and years. And so in the context of a survey, I wanted to kind of pull these through time to kind of talk about what that reach could be, right? Like the idea of a survey looking backwards, that retroactive gaze could have reached all the way back to that time. But also there's a photographic kind of, methodology here. So every single paint stroke is projected and painted. This idea of reiterating my own hand was something I was interested in. And so this very strange elevation of these pieces to a heroic scale became very particular to those particular paintings. But again, talking about translation in terms of trying to forensically recreate this object as closely as possible. This time, it being sort of that redundancy of it being my own hand was something I was interested in. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about this object quickly, and then I will get into the objects I came here to talk about. This is a work called Cradle of Filth. This is a textile sculpture. It actually originated from finding an object on the street. I found it in my hometown of Chicago. Hanging on the back of a dumpster, empty. And it had this very strange kind of totemic gravitas that I couldn't quite get my head around. And so I used it as a found object for a couple of years in a couple of different presentations, actually. I often recycle things. And then finally realized that it was something that I wanted to investigate more deeply and kind of forensically dissect. And so what I did is I worked with a prop maker, or excuse me, a pattern maker who's a friend of mine who was able to help me take the object apart really, really fastidiously. And the entirety of that object is scanned and photographically printed back on fabric and then recreated along with hardware and other objects that kind of complete the whole container of it. What you're obviously looking at is a backpack that's been scrawled over by an anonymous teenager. I was interested in the idea that this is this kind of object that had recorded this moment of a sentient individual kind of confronting their first allegiances to their independence or something about the origins of their creativity here, right? So we kind of took this entire thing apart, printed everything to scale, then re-put the bag together, including the inside. And so everything is anatomically correct, if you will. And here's a scale reference there. I'll show you some details of the surface. There's also some really interesting anxiety in this object that I was interested in thinking about more and more. There's redactions, there's moments in which the individual is changing her mind, and interesting details all over this thing. Those are hand-cast zipper pulls. Interestingly enough, YKK, the zipper company, makes a large-scale, 400-scale zipper. So that's the one thing I didn't make. Still haven't gotten to the bottom of why that exists. But obviously, the zipper pull is not something you wouldn't pull with a large hand. And so that didn't exist, so we had to recreate that. So it's kind of a hybrid there between a ready-made object that's out in the industrial kind of world and then sculpture. That's a cast resin buckle and some large-scale webbing that we were able to source. So a lot of this became a sourcing issue, too, trying to figure out what was available through industrial means and then what things could be made. So really combinations of getting inside these different ways of production, mass production, ready-mades, and the artisanal. And then I'll just briefly touch on this just because this is local news. This is one of 12 paintings that I made in a show here in New York in September at Mitchell & Nash. And this is a body of work that had a sort of performative component in which I entered the gallery space for a period of a month and produced all these large-scale paintings from translations of paper originals. And so this became this incredibly kind of athletic endeavor of trying to race against the clock, literally. And so this meta-narrative of trying to recapitulate these surfaces that had accumulated activity of scribbling and drawing and different spills of food and drink over the course of a year, kind of compressed into this kind of quantum leap into producing this exhibition of 12 large-scale versions. So again, going back to that painting I showed you earlier, reiterating my own hand and kind of entering that space as kind of a performative gesture. Just a detail from that. So I'm going to move on and kind of go backwards in time just a little bit, but just that was just to sort of set you up in terms of talking about scale. And so by this time, this is now 2013. And this is the MCA in Chicago. This is the plaza of the museum, which has this kind of tripartite presentation. And so as you can see, there was a kind of some runway in terms of using scale. And so the idea of making work in public space or making work of monumental scale was kind of a fitting invitation, possibility. So the museum asked me to propose a project for this three-part space and try to think about, what could possibly work in terms of my practice outdoors, and then also thinking about the city, which is my hometown. And so coming out of that MoCA exhibition I showed you with the enlarger, I was really in a space of thinking about the photographic kind of medium as having an analog to the gaze, and was thinking very much about the relationship between those two things. One of the things that I collect a lot of is vintage books, and so this is a book that the sculptures came out of, and I'll talk about that for a moment. This is a kind of an amateur photo manual called How to Control and Use Photographic Lighting, and this was made in 1980. It was really kind of like a very kind of a thin brochure-like kind of light how-to manual that kind of showed amateur photographers how to use studio lighting to create effects in photographs. And for a long time I'd had this book, and actually a couple copies of this book, because it's something I kept finding at thrift stores over and over, in my studio. And it had this chapter called The Character and Shape of Illuminated Things. And one of the things that I confronted immediately when thinking about public space was that I realized, even though I had had a lot of experience making big things and thinking about scale, the assignment of making something outdoors was completely different. And all of a sudden, I panicked because I felt like this is really difficult. And one of the things that felt like a challenge is that obviously, the idea of scale has an expectation already. And so one of the things that I had been doing for years and years was kind of working against certain expectations of the interior. So all of a sudden, a plaza space in which scale is expected became this really complicated code to crack. So I spent quite a bit of time thinking. I went through many, many, many proposals in my head about what I might do. And one of my problems was I couldn't quite figure out what I was interested in monumentalizing. And one of the things that I felt like would happen is that if I made the selection of a specific object, it would slip very easily into surrealism and in a way that would be a disservice to the work. And I thought, there's something here that I can figure this out. Let me think a little bit more. And I'd had these photographs in the studio for probably about 5 years, and I had known for a long time I was going to use these for something, but I hadn't quite sorted it out. Anyway, I'll show you the original pictures and kind of talk through it. But what the photographer David Brooks in this book did was he set up this vignette of these three objects. It's a cube, obviously, a mannequin head, and a sphere, and he painted them 18% gray. And then he performed all of these different lighting techniques or lighting setups in order to kind of produce different effects in the images, just to demonstrate, the range of tone and the spectrum of kind of quality that images could take based on just light. And so there's an incredibly beautiful set of pictures. And I think what I was attracted to with these right away was that there was something, obviously they have an aesthetic quality that's interesting, but there was something else that was kind of really snagging. And I realized that what I was interested in is that these objects were these decoys or stand-ins for anything you might see with your camera. And so by extension, they're decoys for anything you might see, right? So that the idea being they are meant to disappear as content. They're kind of just these placeholders for your gaze, to sort of call attention to your gaze, and also to call attention to light. And so all of a sudden, as I was kind of reviewing these pictures and looking back at these, I realized that this would be a perfect subject, that the idea of these 3 decoy objects would be the perfect thing to monumentalize, because what they would ultimately monumentalize, again, is your gaze. And so that's how I kind of arrived at that for the project. And then I'm just going to talk about this really quick. This is a color correction card, or a color calibration card. Those of you who are photographers or have experienced post-production in any way know what these are. This is a card that you place into an image as you're documenting, either digital or analog, but basically to color correct in post-production. And so I had collected a bunch of these images for a long time, found images of color cards. These are throwaway images that you wouldn't end up keeping, but they allow you to sort of, balance the photo without the card in it. But I was liking how these color cards would kind of just destroy or pollute every picture, so you'd kind of pop it in, and it would kind of create this immediate collage kind of situation. Gotta throw a cat in there. And so I'd been collecting these images for a very long time, and something about that vignette that I ended up making, I wanted there to be this hypersensitivity that the objects themselves had a self-consciousness as photographic subject. So the original 3 objects kind of already have that built into them, but I wanted to sort of heighten that. So I added that into the vignette. This is my fabricator/collaborator that I work with, Lawrence Pullman. He's here in Glendale. You can see that classic car, California plates, with a small color card, so you can kind of get this sense of scale there. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through the production of this piece a little bit, just to give you a sense of how this came to be. This was the first time I was making something of this kind of epic scale. That mannequin piece is 25 feet tall. And the first thing that happened was trying to figure out how to think through that scale, right? So here we are. We found a tree that was 25 feet tall, and we're like, okay, we'll just go stand next to it. I think maybe if you just stand next to it, that'll make me understand how to do it. And then I just literally photoshopped, like, okay, like I can kind of conceptualize what it's like to stand next to an object that tall. I couldn't visualize it. And then we actually brought renderers in to do the real work and actually render it in the plaza space. But just these funny kind of analog things that you go to kind of understand something. And I think actually that has a literal implication of what I'm saying, but there's also this sense of like the analog and the digital and the direct experience and the mediated experience. All of those things are kind of things that I'm consistently kind of slipping on and tossing around in the work. So these are other kind of renderings of the space just to give us a sense of how that would actually function. Here from the inside of the museum, looking out, and there's definitely this like de Chirico vibe happening with these renderings, which I feel like I'd like to bring back into the work at some point. But heretofore, I was really kind of working, even though doing a bunch of fabrication, not necessarily bringing kind of digital scans into the work so much. And so this became kind of a new way of working too. There's human scales. Waving. So how do we actually do this? This was a weird project. So the first thing we did is we found this mannequin head, which is a 1963 mannequin. Again, looking at the photos and trying to forensically figure it out. There was this one photo from the side that showed the kind of copyright, and I found it on eBay. And then we had the hairstyle by a hairstylist based on the images, and then started to build upon that wig with resins and hardeners, and just to get the kind of shape right. And then I worked with an anatomical sculptor to kind of build clay into that hair surface and really make it scannable, because we realized very quickly that this object was something that we needed to bring into the plaza in pieces, and so this had to be milled in many parts. So this is the scan. So that clay version with the mannequin head was then 3D scanned, and then all of these parts were kind of broken down into a puzzle piece, and then milled in reverse molds, and then eventually cast out of fiberglass. So these are visualizations for the different strategies of how we could break that down, which are beautiful in and of themselves. This is not how we ended up doing it, but I love this image, so I always show this image. You can get a sense of like that foam base, all of that is kind of retained in the scan, and kind of like thinking about how this object could exist. This is also this implication of scale beyond, sort of the experience of it, but also the structural stability and all of that kind of stuff. And so here's more images of some of that technical information in terms of, the interior structure for the hair, and all of that became a huge kind of engineering project. Here's how we ended up doing it, which had to do with breaking that hair into 44 parts. So there's 44 molds to make the hair, and they were assembled into rings. So each of those, or rows, so each of those rows contained, 5 or 6 sections, depending on where it was on the head. Here's another kind of image of that. And of course, if you're bringing things across country, you have to also figure out how they fit in vehicles. And so we also had to render, how do we fit this into a truck? And so at this point, that might seem very obvious, but at the time, this was kind of a new way of thinking about scaling. We really have to visualize all of these steps of the process. Here's another proposal for that. It ended up going through 5 or 6 different versions. We did get it there eventually. Here's a scale reference, just to give you a sense of how big that is. The fabricators at one point, this is the one joke I always tell about this piece, the fabricators at this point were like, oh, did you know we figured out the scale and it's 10 inches smaller than the Statue of Liberty? And I was like, oh, why don't you make it bigger than the Statue of Liberty? So anyway, so then we brought it out onto the plaza, and then for almost 3 weeks we were out there building this piece on site. And so one of the things that happened with this work, which is, again, in retrospect, it seems very obvious, but was kind of an interesting sensation to experience firsthand, was this notion of being accessible to viewers in real time on the ground, right? So we were physically there for 3 weeks, and so I realized very acutely all of a sudden that there was such a difference between working in interior spaces and kind of having that kind of sense of being cloistered in this kind of interior, private area, and that there was this beauty to kind of being out in the world and talking to people as they walked by and asked if that was Halle Berry. And so basically we are out there and answering questions all day long, and kind of like really going through this like incredibly laborious kind of set of, kind of like social hurdles as well, which is really interesting. So I'll show you a few more images from the production there. So obviously the tripartite part of the plaza was like a fitting kind of another way that fit that original image. And one of the things I was really interested in was kind of setting up a way in which, again, the objects and the vignette had a self-consciousness as photographic subject. It was very obvious, and I didn't want to make a piece that was about social media, but obviously, especially in the summertime, which is when this first was opened up, that people would consume it through their cameras and particularly through their phones. And so I wanted there to be this extra kind of premeditated kind of accommodation for that, right? That the objects knew you were taking pictures of them. And so that for me kind of created some interesting kind of awareness of the objects, that they were kind of like in dialogue with the viewer, that it wasn't inconsequential they were being documented, that was fit and engineered into the logic, internal logic of the pieces. Here's me sanding the sides of these. We had to put it all together, and of course we had to seam it and then sand all the seams. There I am putting my head on the top of there. And then here we are. You can see the insane internal structure of that steel interior. This part, which we call the wig, is getting hoisted up now, and the kind of crown is kind of lifted on, and then all of these pieces were added individually. And then it was painted on site. So it kind of became, also it was 102 degrees, thank you, Chicago. Super, super hot at that time. But again, this idea of, one of the things I was interested in too was thinking about, okay, so we have this, situation where the photograph becomes both the origin, the source, and it becomes kind of the end result in a way. I was really interested in kind of creating this loop but that by putting a spectacle out into the world, obviously it would be kind of documented and consumed that way, but I wanted there to be absolute kind of integrity to that looping system, that all parts were kind of taken into account in advance. This is a view from across the street, and when the piece is completed. And for me, this was this way of kind of like finding that sweet spot to that original image. And then from there, the piece was up for a year. And so one of the things that happened was it got to see all 4 seasons, which I really enjoyed. But obviously, what the actual images that came out of the piece began to supersede, those original 10. And the light from the sun, as it changed all day long, would actually kind of recreate those images kind of all day as people documented. So I got very kind of excited about that. And it did really work. So these are actually just images of other people's. It just became this engine for image making, which was a really strange and interesting sensation. These are other people's pictures. It's a view from the other side. And so this dialogue started happening that, again, at this point, this is 2013, 2013, maybe less of a complete frenzied moment of social media, but fully engaged at that time. And so this very strange dialogue started happening where people would post it, and I would kind of like have a conversation with them, or kind of, so it was like being able to sort of have their subjectivity made concrete with this kind of photographic production image became this really funny thing. Here's some different versions of the light to give you a sense of how that actually worked. So it was very, very different all day long. Just across from here, you can see there's a bunch of different high-rises, so as the sun would kind of pass between those, it would really dramatically shift the light. I think there's some images of some different seasons. Oh yeah, here's a snow pic. And it created this kind of database that, again, I was linking back to that original kind of volume. And people started getting very creative, as you know. Sunglasses. So all the while that we're doing this, I'm thinking about this project, and I'm thinking about how it's sort of interesting how this is an analog photographic image, but we're now documenting and consuming it through the digital, right? And so that very silly thing kept happening, which was the facial recognition box kept popping up every time we would document the sculpture, and I kept laughing, and we would kind of make jokes about it. But then I realized, oh, there's something really interesting about that. These are just more people's pictures. So shortly after this, I started a conversation with the Public Art Fund about another project that was related to object and image. Obviously, this particular piece had engaged that in such a particular way. It was fitting to kind of to have a conversation about it. And so initially, the conversation was maybe to think about a new piece, or maybe even think about this piece. But then we realized that there was something in conversation that was really interesting to think about how this analog information is being pulled through digital space. And in fact, this sculpture at the MCA almost had an afterlife in the digital realm, right? And so we decided to recapitulate that exact vignette with some alterations. And here's a production shot of me testing the facial recognition on this sculpture, which is a weird thing to do. And so this is the piece in Image Objects. This is now 2015, zooming through a little bit. One of the things we were thinking about was, well, what does happen, when that gets pulled through? It creates this bizarre collage between, the self-consciousness of that initial analog subject matter, these props, these really physical, tactile kind of analog props that were spray painted, and then that gets pulled through digital space. And so we made a version of the piece that was still quite big, still 12 feet, a bit smaller, that depicted the facial recognition box as part of the sculpture. So this is made out of neon. The primary objects are fiberglass, and then the neon itself stays on 24 hours. And so there's something really funny that would happen whereby documenting the piece, there would be this redundancy because the camera would actually continue to do the recognition. So I thought about that as this just really funny little way in which the sculpture would kind of just acknowledge your gaze, just a little callback. So here's a version of that. People posted all sorts of ones in which their selfies were recreating that. And of course, the operating system had been updated, so by that time it was yellow, but it was green when we first produced the sculpture, which was kind of a funny detail. More versions of that. And so that is there. And there was a bit of trickery trying to figure out how to embed all of those electrical components just from a technical aspect, but I won't talk about that too much. And then it had a really nice functionality at night. Okay. So moving out of that project, I was having more and more conversations about making work in the public sphere, and this became something that, and is something that I'm continuously becoming more and more interested in terms of thinking about the forms that I was creating that were much more autobiographical, and thinking about ways in which that can exist in spaces that are shared, right? So this is an image of Basel. This is an aerial view of Basel. This is a Parcours project last year. And I was invited to kind of think about a presentation that I might custom make for this site. Many of you know about the Parcours project, which is usually a presentation of 6 to 15 people, kind of depends, in which it's all pedestrian access to various interior and exterior sites throughout Basel, in which people walk around and really kind of discover things. There's sort of this aspect of discovery to the whole project. And I was thinking a number of things going into the project. Number one, I wanted to figure out if I could do something that resisted the monumental in terms of scale, but still used scale as an implication, and also was maybe decentered and less singular. Those were things that were kind of in my head. And so the first thing I did was I did a site visit, which kind of heavily informed the piece. And so I'm just walking through the area, sort of a limited area where the parcours takes place. And so you have this kind of setting in which like everybody in that zone is kind of collaborating with this presentation. And so as I was walking through the space with Samuel Lundberg, who's the curator, he literally was opening random doors and kind of talking about different possibilities in terms of sites. And I realized that this is an incredibly tight-knit kind of collaborative situation whereby like private residences and cultural institutions and everyone was sort of collaborating to create this presentation. So something about that pedestrian metabolism of viewership, but also this idea of intimacy and access became something that, that I was interested in kind of mining for the project. So we walked through Basel and kind of ended up like circuitously going through a million little doors, and here's just some images from that in terms of winding around. And really thinking about that map and just thinking, that the way viewers were going to kind of experience this was to kind of meander around and maybe discover things. So just a few shots of that. I'm sure many of you have been to Basel. It's also impeccably clean. As you might know, it's Swiss. And so I was thinking about, okay, what could I do? And I was thinking about access, and all of a sudden I had this idea to sort of think about a work that would be scattered throughout the site and would take place or exist or be something that you would find and would not be in a singular location. And so we kind of developed this loose map of where we might put these objects, and I proposed to make this set of keys. So these are my incredibly crappy Photoshop maquettes, just whipping these out just to give a sense of how I might imagine them. And I had this idea of having these keys scattered throughout the town that would be these like loose points of access that weren't ever kind of like connected with anything else. I think it came out of literally finding a key on the ground and thinking about what that might open, and just that lack of resolution was something that was psychically interesting to me, this idea that it has this incredible potential to sort of open some space, but that without that being disclosed, you sort of are left with that being disabled. And so I proposed to kind of create a set of these, and as we were talking more and more, I realized that it might be even more interesting if they actually opened places in town. And so we went into this like labyrinthian process, and this part is a very human analog process of getting access to these keys. So this became a conversation in which we approached a bunch of different cultural institutions in Basel, private residences, all those people that, again, Samuel was opening doors to, and asking if we could take a picture of their key. And with the remote location, and as you might imagine, there's a reticence to someone actually relinquishing their key. So photographs were sort of how we had to approach this, which became a whole other aspect of the project that was kind of wound into things. So these are some of the funny images that kind of originated this conversation. These are various keys that open museum spaces. Some of them are to doors, some of them are to filing cabinets, some of them are to a front door residence, some of them belong to, they're all, it's a huge range. And we went through a bunch of these keys and tried to figure out which ones might be interesting to produce. But in order to do this, this was not an opportunity in which we could scan these keys. So from a technical aspect, it presented this huge hurdle, and also this kind of very funny complication to the whole trust aspect of the piece. So these are some of those images. Also very casual, kept trying to get these very dead-on photographs, and that was not working out so well for me. So these are some of the original pieces. And then I thought, it would be interesting if there was this way in which somehow that culminated in some kind of organizing principle. And so I literally looked down and I had this gold carabiner of my own keys on my hip. And I thought, okay, let's think about kind of this idea of this object kind of being this, this somewhat of a resolution somewhere in the presentation. So as you're walking around, you're finding loose keys on the ground, and then eventually you sort of come across this key ring. Kind of obvious, but I liked that implication that maybe, depending on the sequence of how you would encounter them or what would happen, that you might kind of have this, this sensation of a narrative unfolding slowly and kind of time releasing some kind of conversation, but yet that never really being kind of divulged or revealed. So here's the ones we picked in the end. And I ended up working with a 3D modeler, and we elaborately recreated every key in 3D, which was a little bit labor-intensive, labor-intensive. And I'll just show you some of those images just to give you a sense of the actual kind of the sculptural aspect of this, which is really building this object from an image from the ground up to be milled in aluminum and then plated. These are some of the images. Again, these renderings are something that I feel like we'll loop back into the work in some other way. So I'm showing them as a sort of precursor to that little forecast. So after producing all of these, we had the files, all the objects were milled out of aluminum, and then were plated in various colors to match the keys as closely as possible. In the presentation of the pieces, you really just find them. They don't, they're not named in terms of where they go to. And that was a really important part of the piece. And then I'll show you some images of the actual keys themselves. So here we are, one of them installed. One of the things we encountered immediately is that when you have cobblestones that are from, let's say, the 15th century, they don't really like you to drill into them. There's a lot of issues with that kind of permanence. And so that became an interesting kind of factor in the piece, that there was an effectiveness to the weird finding of these objects. By the way, the piece is called Untitled Findings, Access. And I was really interested in this idea that it created this kind of weird ripple in the space-time continuum where people really wanted to pick them up. And it had to do, I think, with a number of things. Just the very obvious thing, that it's a shiny object, and it's on the ground, it has a pedestrian thing. But I really do think that there was a sensation of an impulse about a lost thing, right? Like you just have to go grab it, and that kept happening over and over. And so some additional security measures had to be put in place. Let's just say it like that. But there was a pleasure, I think, to sort of hopefully walking around the site and really being able to discover these pieces and, again, kind of having this curiosity about their origin. And this was a special one. This was down by the water. And actually, there were some fun interactions with this one, as you might imagine, as well. Yeah. And then throughout the course of the exhibition, the other thing about this that was important is that it was incredibly temporal. The viewing window of this piece was only about a week, and so I was really kind of hyper aware of the fact that this would be about this particular moment in time for a limited audience, and so I really wanted there to be this moment of like the sensitivity to how each object was installed to sort of like really feel as though you kind of found this thing, and so that was a hard balance to strike in this incredibly busy moment This is another one that we kind of hung on the side of one of the buildings. It's a detail there. And then this is the key ring. That's the full one on the left, and then a detail on the right side. This is made, this one we were able to scan because we did have it there in town, and then it's made through a bunch of, again, labyrinthine fabrication methods. But again, the other interesting part about this project was similarly that in some ways that the photographs that viewers started to take kind of created this other kind of sensation of like, these breadcrumbs that were kind of being left around, and I was really interested in that. So as people kind of documented the pieces on their own, there was this other interesting looping effect, that aspect of the piece as well. Even though photography was less kind of, engineered into the piece in comparison to the other two, I felt like it did have kind of play a role. And I will leave you with this image because this is probably the best image we got out of the, I have no idea exactly how this came to be. The internet, thank you internet. But different people interacting with objects. Of course, the idea of access not limiting itself to the sort of, subject matter, but also thinking about how objects in public space, do really kind of facilitate that. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there and answer any questions if you guys have them. And I really appreciate you coming out. Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering how your works lend to be unique or re-rendered or additioned, like the key ring work is an addition or a unique work?
Usually unique, and the reason for that for me is there's actually a couple of cases in which I've additioned things, but typically if I'm going to the length of making something, I really like this idea that the origin is met with one other object, and so replicating it kind of feels as though it disables something really particular. Also logistically, that's often not possible because of how something's made, like it's physically not possible, but mostly it's a choice of like really wanting to meet the intimacy of that original object with one other thing in the world. And so very early I kind of, established, that's a good question, because I very early kind of established that for the most part, unless there was a reason for something to exist more than once as a second object, that was really important, in fact, that it just be the one origin thing in the world and then the new thing in the world. So yeah, I'm pretty rigid about that. There's a couple of cases. I think there was actually that double mask. I made 4 of those simply because it was funny to double it. It was like a double-double. And so I wanted to do like that was like a way of playing with that sculptural space. But actually I didn't do it again after that because I felt like I was most interested in that kind of, that one-to-one kind of relationship. So, yeah, thanks. Is there someone else?
Hi. Early in your talk, you used the phrase objects that are lens sensitive. Mm-hmm. Could you say more about how you think about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that some of them are really obvious in terms of, the pieces that are originate from props. In which case, those objects have already played a role in some photographic system. But then I also am thinking about it in kind of a larger sense in terms of I think part of it has been working with people who make things for moving image or still image, and sort of what that alongside my parallel interest in mining photographs for sculptural information is sort of thinking about like what is possible through the pictorial kind of version of that thing. And then most notably I think in the MCA piece was really thinking about how do you make something kind of self-aware as an object that it sort of understands it's being seen, and making some kind of like analog between the gaze and the apparatus of sort of a picture-making device in some way. So the optics being not limited to the apparatus, but also being something in terms of how we see. So there's sort of some really literal ways in which I mean that in terms of like, I'm also interested in to the disdain of or to the dissatisfaction of some people. I really like the images of the sculptures that are not included with a scale reference, and one of the reasons for that is that it kind of returns the object back into this referenceless space in which it kind of deactivates that possibility of it being something that has already been kind of changed. And so through the image, it kind of disables the object and kind of privileges standing in front of it. So yeah, I think that there's kind of some literal ways in which I kind of think about that, and then some broader senses. But a lot of it, again, is thinking about how the temporality that kind of comes into object making when it's meant to be seen, that it's the facticity of its objecthood is not the end game. It's for a mediated gaze, if that makes sense.
I actually would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
You just used the expression "how we see," but also I think a lot of your work at least evokes questions of how we are seen, and especially maybe thinking a lot about in public space, maybe talking about surveillance and these types of things. Is this something you've given much thought to in your work, and how does that sort of feature into it?
Yeah. I think I sort of put together this really specific body of work tonight for the purposes of this talk, but I kind of left out a whole section of things in which self-surveillance is a huge kind of component. In the first architectural piece I showed you, a little bit dovetails into some of that in terms of thinking about watching myself work and thinking about ways in which I can kind of be a maker and an observer at the same time, and that the sensibility of the work kind of is born from that duality or shifting between those two gazes or those two roles. And then surveillance, for sure. I think that, I guess in a very dumb way, like we're in that condition right now of full self-surveillance, like it's kind of continuous. And so both in terms of this sort of individual work, like the exhibition that I did here in New York in September, in terms of like looking at my own mark making as a way of like that peripheral space being in play. That's one way in which, sort of looking back at all of the traces, and then everything is kind of reanalyzed or sort of kind of put through the mill again. I think there's something about the combination of that immediacy and that surveillance that is maybe the sensibility of maybe all the work in a way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little bit blinded. Anybody else? Yeah. I think there's one, and then
you had that source for the MCA show from a book by David Brooke.
David Brooks, yeah.
Yeah. Was he ever told about this, or is he dead?
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. He's alive.
And
yeah, I didn't mention. I actually should have mentioned that part. So he had a very common name, obviously. So it was somebody that I researched and eventually found, and had a very long conversation actually about the project. And he was in full support and actually had a very interesting take. First of all, it was completely bizarrely surprised that I had found this book. He said that it was kind of this job that he had done and had forgotten about it, and was kind of like really in his obscure archives, and he had kind of was really super surprised that I had dug it out of a thrift store kind of pile or something. But I also found some interesting information about the images and the projects that he had undertaken, because one of the things I was interested in that book, which I didn't really talk about, is that there was some really weird nuances to the language, because he also wrote the text in the book as well, that I found had kind of a inadvertent poetic. And I like to think that I sort of like, I don't know, was attracted to his brain through these different, even though it was like a little commercial side project he had done. Turns out that he had had designs on being an artist. He lived in LA. Those objects were purchased at a prop shop that he couldn't tell me where it was, and he gave me the provenance and kind of the story of all the objects. And he was really super interested in kind of the idea of like pulling this back into the world. And so he sent me all these new texts that he had made since then. Unfortunately, my dream was to bring him to Chicago to photograph it, and I begged him to do it, but he wasn't well enough. He wasn't feeling healthy enough to travel. But yeah, I had his full support, so that was really nice. We had a very, very kind of fascinating, long conversation and set of emails about why I might want to do that why I would want to pull those into physical space. And he was actually very, very interested and very, he had a lot of really kind of amazing insights about it. But I liked that it kind of led back to this kind of way in which he was making this creative job, kind of a creative endeavor for him. So yeah, and he continues to make now these PDFs that are illuminate like, you know, digital techniques. So he's still doing it. So, you had a question?
How difficult was it to do a public art project in a foreign city versus New York or Chicago?
Yeah. I think I touched on it a little bit in terms of actual regulations in terms of the age of the site or what was, you know, whether it was a public space or a private space. But incredibly, there was a much more reverence for the sort of antiquity of the architecture. Specifically, we were not allowed to drill into any cobblestone or we had to find ways to sort of attach things, and, you know, we had to be creative in terms of, you know, thinking around those things and respecting the sites, but also, yeah, very different kind of sensation. Obviously, the Plaza site is made for, you know, public work, and so it's ready to be drilled into a million times, and it's a different thing. But yeah, the sensibility was incredibly different, and a lot of it had to do with the age and frankly, the antiquity of all of the surfaces that we were trying to put things on. However, there was a lot of willingness to sort of like, it was less of a bureaucratic situation. It was more about preserving the actual material, like an actual kind of reverence for that, which is an interesting distinction, I think. Chicago, and here to some degree, I mean, you had kind of, you know, obviously regulations in terms of safety and things that were probably, but then again, that piece was a little bit different. It didn't have anything that could tip over and crush anybody. So we had less things to worry about in that regard. But yeah, so I'd say less bureaucratic, but more protective in other arenas. So, thank you. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
When you were in Basel collecting keys for your project, were the owners of private residencies ever skeptical, or did they immediately trust you? Like, what was the process of getting the keys?
Yeah, well, I had to do it remotely because when I was there the first time, I didn't plan the project right then. So I did the site visit to kind of like establish the project. So I didn't actually have, all of that was remote. So there was a very weird kind of set of conversations where, yeah, of course, I mean, that was part of the implication, was to see who would be kind of willing to do this. Of course, there's nothing that really could happen security-wise unless you went to elaborate lengths, right? But rescanning it something and then remaking a key, right? But the conversation of like a little bit of caution. But then again, that community was also, I mean, I think I was interested in the willingness of that community as part of the kind of project, you know what I mean? Everyone in that area was very close-knit in terms of being part of this ongoing exhibition. And so there was this sensation of like, yeah, of collaboration. Like people were pretty willing in general. Of course, there were people who said no, but there were more, you know, it was a larger percentage of people who were willing, which I thought was actually kind of interesting. But I think it has to do with the history of that project and that space and the way that all of those people are kind of like, you know, annually participating in this thing that they take pride in and are, you know, interested in being part of in some way. So in some ways, I think it was nice that it was like, rather than just using a site, it was also kind of like a little bit of like incorporating their role in that town into the piece in some way. Nothing's ever really named explicitly, so there is this, you know, aspect of like, it kind of, you know, it's a dead loop. But yeah, there were some people who were cautious, of course, especially with, you know, doors that would open. I mean, obviously, the, you know, stakes, depending on the stakes of the door or the lock, whatever it was. But yeah, there was actually, I think I was almost kind of, the project was initiated by that willingness in a weird way. So, yeah, thanks. Right.
Any other questions?
Hi. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the kind of iconicizing and the crazy scale shifts. Has that always been in your work? Has that been something that's been, like, how did that enter into the work? And that seems to be so important that so much hangs on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you got kind of an interesting slice, because typically when I present the work, I kind of show like a longer view of like the slow mutation of things and the way that it kind of, so I kind of give you an abrupt entry into the whole thing. I mean, I think I tried to talk tonight about how photography has actually been the main way in which that has come into the work. So that and experience with prop making, like thinking about, growing up in a household in which photographs were produced, that I think kind of created this sensation of, and familiarity with that medium that had a very particular kind of sense of scaling. Yes, I did. Yes. I didn't. I should have mentioned that. I met a prop maker because I had made props. So making things in that context, but also I do think that medium actually is the real origin if I really kind of examine it. But I'm also interested in hyperbole, and I'm interested in ways in which kind of the amplified can do something that is related to intimacy. Like I describe it as like a photographic kind of sensibility that like an object can have those parameters, both pictorially in terms of how it presents or how it's self-conscious, but then also, allowing that, the scaling to sort of promote some, it's almost like a close-up photograph, right? Like it delivers the information in kind of a closer way. So it's not meant to alienate, it's meant to kind of bring the data to your eyes closer and to kind of like hopefully mimic my own close attention to forms, just deliver those forms in kind of a more intimate way. So they're really meant to kind of like function like, like a close-up image or something that is about kind of a slowness or an absorption of the detail, anatomical detail, kind of over a longer period of time in the way that a still thing works. Right? Because even if you have an object in space that's still, there's this sensation of your own motion that kind of changes the temporality, whereas like the stillness of an image, I think is still something I'm kind of interested in figuring out in objects, if that makes sense. So maybe that's the other way in which the lens-based image question could be also spoken to. And then also working on productions and learning how to make props. I think also having a performative background and being embedded in stagecraft from an early age, heavily programmed child from like dance to ice skating to, like many stage-based productions. So the idea of the production is something that has always been kind of a part of my life. And so I do think that comes into it as well. Yeah, one thing that's important, and one thing that's maybe a bit misleading with the talk is that I kind of curated all of those objects next to each other, but that's certainly not how they're shown. In other words, you would never walk into I would never have an exhibition of sort of all large things. That's not how I work. And in fact, I'm much more interested in the disruption of like creating an equilibrium in an installation space, and then one object or two objects kind of creating a break in that. Equity or something, or equilibrium. So they're never really seen in this way where they're one after another, and so it gives a little bit of a deceitful kind of sensation that that's the lineage. It's really kind of, there's definitely sort of a zooming quality to things, so you'll sort of have much more intimate, smaller details and things that are much more subtle and operate on nuance, and then things that kind of operate in that volume intentionally so that they bristle against each other and kind of have that kind of diversity. So seeing them one after another is kind of creates this world of giant stuff, which isn't exactly right, although there is at this point a good amount of them. So anyway.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Thank you all.
Thank you guys.
Thank you,
so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Have a great night.